In a noisy roadside bar, it all started as harmless fun until Brock Lesnar decided to prove that strength mattered more than respect. He hit Chuck Norris with a chair in front of everyone, certain it would make him look invincible. But within a minute, the entire bar fell silent, and the legendary fighter stood before him without saying a word. What happened next became a lesson Brock would never forget. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The desert night had a way of swallowing sound. Along the faded stretch of Route 66, where rusted signs leaned like tired sentinels, and the wind whispered across cracked asphalt, the Iron Spur bar glowed like a lonely ember in the dark. Its neon sign flickered, painting the gravel parking lot in restless red and blue. Inside, country music hummed faintly from an ancient jukebox, its melody barely audible beneath the murmur of voices, the clatter of glasses, and the low laughter of men too tired to care who was listening. Mike Daniels stood behind the counter, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. He'd been doing that for 30 years, his hands moving with muscle memory, while his eyes watched the room the way an old soldier surveys a battlefield. Trouble, he'd learned, had a smell, a mix of sweat, liquor, and ego, and tonight the air was heavy with it. The crowd was louder than usual. The regulars sat in their usual places, truckers with sunburned necks and mechanics with oil-stained fingers, but there were strangers too. Big men, loud ones, the kind who tested their strength on whatever stood close enough to break. In the far corner of the bar, sitting alone at a small round table, was a man most of them didn't recognize. He wore a black t-shirt, jeans, and worn leather boots. His beard was trimmed, his hair short and gray. His posture was relaxed but deliberate, his back to the wall, his gaze sweeping the room in lazy arcs that missed nothing. A glass of water sat untouched before him, condensation forming small rivers that ran down to the wooden surface. Mike knew who he was, not because the man had said it, but because Mike had seen that calm before. The kind of stillness that came from a lifetime of knowing exactly what you could do and never needing to prove it. Chuck Norris hadn't spoken to anyone since he'd walked in. He'd nodded to Mike, ordered his water, said thank you, and that was all. He wasn't there to talk. He wasn't there to be seen. But even in his silence, people noticed. A few younger men at a nearby table whispered, glancing toward him. "That's him," one muttered, half in disbelief. "I swear it's him." The other frowned, unsure, until Chuck turned slightly in their direction, and they both fell quiet. Mike smiled faintly to himself. He'd seen it before. Real power didn't shout, it radiated. It changed the temperature of a room. It was just past 10 when the sound of a truck engine rumbled outside, followed by the slam of heavy doors. The jukebox seemed to falter as the front entrance swung open, letting in a rush of cold desert air and the silhouettes of three men. The tallest of them moved like something that didn't fit through doors easily. His shoulders brushed the frame, his steps heavy enough to make the floorboards complain. The laughter that followed him wasn't joyful. It was the laughter of dominance, of someone who expected the world to react when he entered it. Mike didn't need to ask. He recognized the face from television, from headlines, from posters that once hung in gyms and arenas. Brock Lesnar had walked into the Iron Spur. He wore a sleeveless denim vest over a tight black shirt, veins crawling like cords across his arms. His head was shaved close, his jaw set in the way of men who've spent too long expecting resistance. His eyes scanned the room, quick and cold, cataloging everyone and everything, the tables, the exits, the mirrors behind the bar. Then, with a grunt of satisfaction, he strode toward the counter. His two companions, both smaller men with the restless energy of followers, trailed close behind. "Bourbon," Brock said, slapping a hand the size of a shovel on the counter. "The bottle. Keep the glass." Mike didn't argue. He took a bottle from the shelf, set it down, and stepped back. Brock unscrewed the cap, took a long pull, and exhaled through his nose like a bull. The smell of alcohol joined the smoky air. "Hell of a night for a drink," one of his buddies said, already half drunk. "It's a hell of a night for anything," Brock replied, his voice deep and edged with the growl of confidence that had carried him through rings and cages and headlines. He looked around, his lips curling in amusement. Place like this has got history. You can feel it. Sweat, blood, and cheap whiskey. Some of the regulars chuckled politely. A few raised their glasses in nervous camaraderie. The man was a legend after all, a monster in human form, a name that could fill arenas. Brock liked the attention. He always had. He leaned on the counter, telling a story about a fight years ago. Some brawler who thought he could take him down in the octagon. The crowd responded with gasps and laughter. The rhythm of dominance came naturally to him. He fed on it. Then halfway through his next drink, his gaze drifted toward the corner, toward the man sitting alone. Chuck hadn't moved. He sat with his back straight, hands folded loosely around his glass of water, eyes lowered just enough to make it clear that he wasn't impressed. To Brock, that look was more insulting than an insult. He turned to his friends, his grin spreading. "You see that? Old man's ignoring me." One of them laughed nervously. "Maybe he just doesn't know who you are." "Oh, he knows," Brock said. "They all do." He raised his voice, pitching it just enough to carry across the bar. "Hey, old-timer. You planning to order a real drink, or you sticking to water all night?" Conversations quieted. Eyes turned. The air shifted, the way it does before lightning strikes. Chuck looked up. Just a glance. Calm, steady, unreadable. Then he went back to his water. Brock smirked. "Guess he's shy." Mike started to say something, but Brock's laughter drowned him out. "You know where I come from, men drink whiskey, not water." The tension tightened around the room like a drawn wire. "I think you should leave him alone," Mike said evenly. "He's not bothering anyone." Brock turned to him, grin fading. "You trying to tell me how to talk, old man?" "I'm telling you there's no need to start something," Mike replied, his tone steady. He'd dealt with worse men before, but never one who radiated this kind of dangerous energy. Brock held his stare for a long moment, then shrugged. "Relax, I'm just talking." He turned back toward Chuck. "You hear that, old man? Just talking." Still no reaction, and that more than anything made something inside Brock start to boil. He wasn't used to being ignored. His entire life had been built around reactions, crowds screaming his name, opponents cowering or posturing back. Silence was alien to him. It was like throwing punches into fog. He grabbed his bottle again, took another long drink, and slammed it down on the counter hard enough to rattle the glasses. "Hey, you deaf or just rude?" Chuck lifted his head slowly. His eyes met Brock's, calm as still water, old and knowing. Then he spoke, voice quiet, even gentle. "Sitting here, drinking water, that's all." Something about the simplicity of it, the absence of fear, the lack of apology, pushed Brock over the edge of irritation into something else. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Water, huh?" he said, stepping away from the bar. "Guess when you get old, you stop trusting your liver." Still nothing. "You too good to talk, Grandpa?" Chuck looked at him again, not with anger, but with the kind of focus that made Brock feel, for just a heartbeat, like the younger man in the room. Mike felt it too. He moved his hand toward the bat under the counter, the same one he'd only used twice in 3 decades. Brock's friend whispered, "Maybe leave it, man. He's just—" "Quiet," Brock snapped. He was performing now, even if he didn't realize it. Every movement, every word was an act for the audience that surrounded him. His life had been one long performance, and he didn't know how to stop. He took another step forward. "You look familiar," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Weren't you that guy in those old karate flicks? What was it, the 70s? My dad used to watch that stuff. Said you were tough." Chuck didn't reply. He just turned his gaze back to his water, took a slow sip, and set the glass down gently. The crowd held its breath. Brock's grin tightened. "Guess you're not that tough anymore." Mike tried again. "That's enough, Lesnar." But Brock wasn't listening. He needed a reaction. He needed the man to acknowledge him. The silence was worse than mockery. It was erasure. "Let's see how tough you really are," Brock said, his voice rising. He grabbed the nearest bar stool, wood scraping against the floor. For an instant, someone shouted, "Don't!" But the word came too late. The stool came down across Chuck's shoulders with a crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. Wood splintered, fragments scattering across the floor. Chuck didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He simply leaned forward slightly, hands flat on the table to steady himself. Then he straightened, the remnants of the stool sliding from his shoulders, and turned his head toward Brock. The entire room froze. Mike felt his heartbeat in his throat. The sound of a bottle rolling on the floor seemed deafening in the silence that followed. Chuck's eyes met Brock's again, calm, steady, not angry, not afraid. He spoke softly. "You done?" And for the first time that night, Brock Lesnar didn't know what to say. He stood there, breathing hard, the broken remains of the stool still clutched in his fists, staring at a man who should have been on the floor but wasn't. The legend, the champion, the unstoppable beast, and the old man who hadn't even raised his voice. The silence in the iron spur felt alive, pressing against every wall, filling every corner. The audience that had cheered Brock minutes earlier now sat motionless, waiting. Even the jukebox had gone quiet, as if the music itself knew it didn't belong in this moment. Outside, the desert wind howled softly against the windows. Inside, something far greater than a fight was about to begin. And as Mike reached again for the bat beneath the counter, he already knew. This wasn't going to be a night anyone in the Iron Spur would ever forget. For several long seconds, no one in the Iron Spur moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended between disbelief and awe. Chuck Norris sat still, the remains of the shattered bar stool scattered like debris from an explosion, wood fragments littering the floor around his boots. Brock Lesnar stood before him, chest heaving, his fists clenched around the splintered legs of what moments ago had been a solid piece of oak. His mind, still humming with adrenaline, could not reconcile what his eyes were seeing. He had struck with all his strength, a blow that would have dropped any man, any fighter, anyone made of flesh and bone. But this man hadn't even blinked. Chuck lifted his glass of water, the rim chipped from the vibrations of the impact, and took a slow sip. He set it down again with the precision of someone who had never been in a hurry in his life. Then he turned slightly toward Brock, the movement so calm it was almost disorienting. His voice came out quiet, low, without anger. "You done?" The question echoed like a bell through the stillness. Brock blinked, the sound of his own pulse roaring in his ears. The words weren't defiant. They weren't mocking. They just existed, unbothered by the violence that had preceded them. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Around him, the crowd shifted uneasily, afraid to speak, afraid to move, as if any sound might shatter the fragile line holding this moment together. Mike Daniels, still behind the bar, didn't reach for the phone this time. He'd seen enough bar fights in his life to know what this was and what it wasn't. The old man wasn't scared, wasn't posturing, wasn't even angry. He was simply present, grounded in a way that made everyone else in the room feel suddenly, terrifyingly human. Brock's breathing grew louder, rougher, the kind of breathing that comes from confusion rather than exhaustion. He dropped the broken stool, the wooden legs clattering against the floor. "You think that's funny, old man?" he growled. Chuck didn't move. "I hit you with a chair." Brock's voice rose slightly incredulous. "Do you even feel pain?" Chuck's gaze was steady. "Pain's temporary. Reactions last longer." Something about the line hit Brock harder than the old man's unflinching composure. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered verbally or philosophically. In his world, there were only two modes: dominance and defeat. Yet here he was, face to face with someone who occupied neither space. A murmur rippled through the bar. Someone near the back whispered, "Holy hell, he's just sitting there." "Maybe we should leave," said one of Brock's companions, nervously glancing toward the exit. Brock ignored him. His pride was now something alive, coiled and snarling in his chest. Every instinct screamed that he had to reassert control, to remind the room who he was. But there was something in Chuck's eyes, something ancient, unshakable, that made him hesitate for the first time in years. He took a step forward, boots creaking against the floorboards. "You got something smart to say? Say it now," he demanded. Chuck tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a teacher studies a student, before deciding whether the lesson will be worth giving. "You don't want what you think you want," he said softly. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're looking for a fight," Chuck replied. But you're not fighting me. The words hung there, suspended in the smoke-filled air. Brock frowned, confused, his anger faltering just enough for the message to slip through. "Oh, I'm not, huh?" he said with a humorless chuckle. "You saying I'm crazy?" "No," Chuck said. "Just lost." For a heartbeat, silence reigned again. Then, slowly, cruelly, laughter began to bubble from one of Brock's friends. The kind of laughter that tries to fill a space too heavy for courage. "Lost, huh? You hear that, Brock? The old man's calling you lost." The laughter died the moment Brock turned and shot him a glare that could have frozen stone. Then he looked back at Chuck. "You got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice quieter but far more dangerous. "But you've also got a death wish." He took another step closer. Chuck didn't retreat. Their eyes locked. Around them, the bar seemed to shrink. "Why don't you stand up, old man?" Brock said, his tone dropping to a growl. "Let's see if you're as calm on your feet as you are in that chair." Mike started to step out from behind the counter. "Brock, stay out of this!" Brock barked without looking at him. Chuck exhaled slowly through his nose, then pushed his glass slightly aside. His hands, still steady, rested on the edge of the table. For a moment it seemed as though he might ignore the provocation again. But then, with a movement so smooth it seemed choreographed, he rose to his feet. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't puff out his chest or square his shoulders like fighters do before they swing. He just stood, and somehow in that motion, the atmosphere changed. The bar felt smaller, tighter. Brock realized then that the man was taller than he'd expected. Leaner, yes, but solid, the kind of strength that comes from decades of refinement, not months of training. Chuck's face was calm, almost serene, but there was weight behind his stillness, a kind of gravity that pulled at the edges of the room. "I'm not looking for trouble," Chuck said quietly. "Then why are you still standing?" Brock's voice cracked like a whip. Chuck's eyes held his. "Because some things don't run from storms. They wait until they pass." That quiet confidence, that maddening calm, was like lighter fluid on Brock's temper. His lips curled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You talk in riddles, old man. Let me simplify it for you." He grabbed another bar stool. Mike shouted, "Don't!" But it was too late. Brock hurled the stool across the space between them, the wood splintering as it struck the wall inches from Chuck's head. The impact left a jagged hole in the plaster. Chuck hadn't flinched. He looked at the ruined wall, then back at Brock, his tone unchanged. "Done breaking furniture, or do you need more practice?" A low laugh rolled through the bar, nervous, incredulous, half-admiring. Brock turned toward the sound, his glare scattering it instantly. The laughter died. He turned back, teeth bared now. "You think you're untouchable?" "No," Chuck said simply. "Just prepared." Something in Brock snapped. He took a long stride forward, his shadow falling over the smaller man. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his words trembling with rage. Chuck's reply was almost tender. "Neither do you." Before Brock could react, Mike stepped between them, dish towel still in hand, voice low and urgent. "That's enough, both of you. You want to fight, take it outside." Brock's nostrils flared. "You really want to protect this guy, Mike?" "You know what happens when I know exactly what happens," Mike interrupted. "And I know you'll regret it before your fist even lands." Brock blinked, thrown by the certainty in the old bartender's tone. "You afraid for me or for him?" "I'm afraid of what you're about to learn," Mike said quietly. It should have been enough to stop him. It wasn't. Brock shoved past him. The older man stumbled back, catching himself on the counter. The room was silent again, every eye following the slow, terrible inevitability of what was unfolding. "Last chance," Brock said. "Walk away." Chuck looked at him, then at the crowd as though taking measure of how many witnesses there would be. "You really think this is about me?" he asked. Brock frowned. "What the hell else would it be about?" Chuck sighed, the faintest hint of sadness crossing his features. "You'll see soon enough. It was not a threat. It was a promise, and worse, a truth." The sound of Brock's heavy breathing filled the silence as he squared his stance. The energy in the room was electric, the line between anticipation and fear vanishing. His fists curled, muscles coiled. Everything in his body screamed forward motion, dominance, the primal urge to crush what refused to bow. He lunged suddenly, closing the distance between them in a blink, but Chuck stepped aside with a motion so minimal it barely registered. It wasn't a dodge. It was a redirection, a whisper of movement that allowed the storm to pass without resistance. Brock stumbled half a step, caught himself, turned. The crowd murmured, confused by the simplicity of what they'd seen. He'd missed, cleanly. Chuck's expression didn't change. He merely said, "You've got too much energy, not enough direction." The humiliation burned in Brock's chest. He was used to being feared, not studied. He charged again, faster this time, swinging wide. The punch carved through empty air as Chuck swayed, letting it pass harmlessly by. "Stop dancing," Brock roared. Chuck's eyes softened. "Stop swinging." The juxtaposition, the fury against the calm, was unbearable. Brock grabbed the table beside them and flipped it over, sending glasses crashing to the floor. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted. "No," Chuck said, voice even, quiet. "Just older." The bar was silent again. Even the hum of the neon sign outside seemed distant. Brock stood there, chest heaving, sweat beading along his brow. Every fiber of his being told him to attack, to assert control, to win. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the noise of adrenaline and ego, a small, unwelcome thought flickered. What if I can't? He crushed it immediately, pushing forward again. But this time, when his massive arms swung out, Chuck moved closer instead of away. Their shoulders brushed. Chuck's right hand rose in a blur, his fingertips grazing Brock's forearm. The contact was feather light, but Brock's wrist twisted involuntarily, the nerves screaming in confusion. He stumbled back, shaking out his arm. "What the—" he began, but Chuck interrupted softly. "Pressure point." Brock froze. "You think you can take me down with your magic tricks?" Chuck's gaze was almost kind. "No tricks, just knowledge." Brock took another step forward, but the confidence in his movements was beginning to erode. He didn't understand what he was facing, and worse, he felt the room turning against him. The crowd that once cheered his every show of dominance now watched with quiet fascination, their loyalty shifting toward the man who seemed to move through the world like gravity itself. Mike stayed where he was, towel hanging limp in his hand, his instincts telling him that what was happening transcended the simple chaos of a bar fight. This was something deeper, something that would echo long after the bruises faded. Brock drew himself up, forcing a smirk. "You're a tough old bastard, I'll give you that." Chuck nodded once. "Age teaches patience. Patience teaches control." The response disarmed Brock in a way no blow could. For a moment, he felt absurd, like a child throwing stones at a mountain, trying to prove he could move it. He clenched his jaw. "You talk too much." "Only when someone needs to listen," Chuck replied. The faintest ripple of laughter ran through the bar, quickly swallowed by silence when Brock's eyes flashed. He looked around the room, seeing his audience, realizing how their expressions had changed. There was no longer admiration there, no longer awe, only curiosity and perhaps pity. That, more than anything, stung. He turned back to Chuck, voice low, shaking. "You think you can embarrass me?" Chuck didn't answer. He simply lifted his water glass again, took another sip, and said softly, "You're doing that yourself." That was the final spark. The last barrier holding back the storm broke. Brock's roar filled the bar, a raw, primal sound that made the walls tremble. The crowd scattered backward, giving the two men space. Chairs scraped, bottles toppled, and Mike whispered a prayer under his breath. The moment had arrived. There would be no more talking. And as Brock squared himself to charge once more, the old fighter's calm eyes held him, reflecting something he couldn't understand, but somehow feared, a quiet promise that this fight would teach him far more than victory ever had. The air trembled with tension, the flickering neon outside casting stripes of red and blue across their faces. And then, without warning, Brock Lesnar lunged. The moment Brock Lesnar lunged, the world inside the iron spur seemed to contract. His massive frame tore through the air like a freight train unleashed, the floorboards trembling beneath his boots. every muscle alive with explosive intent. He had lived his entire life through motion. Through force fighting was not something he did, it was something he was. Every punch, every tackle, every victory had been earned by overpowering whatever stood in his way. But tonight, that instinct met something immovable. Chuck Norris didn't brace himself, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His eyes followed Brock's charge the way a sailor watches a storm rolling across the sea. Calm, analytical, patient. And then, at the last possible heartbeat, he stepped aside. Just one step, fluid and exact, his body barely shifting in space. Brock's shoulder carved through the empty air where the man had been. The momentum sent him stumbling past, his own strength betraying him. The sound of his boots skidding across the wooden floor was followed by a collective gasp from the spectators. Chuck turned slowly, pivoting on the ball of his foot, his gaze never leaving Brock. His movements were so deliberate they seemed unreal, as if the air bent around him rather than resisted him. Brock stopped, breathing hard, his pulse hammering in his temples. For a split second, confusion flashed across his face. He had missed. That didn't happen. He spun around and swung a backhand meant to shatter bone. Again, Chuck leaned just enough for the blow to whistle past. The swing carried Brock forward another step, off balance. Chuck's hand moved, just a subtle flick of the wrist, and two fingers brushed against a point on Brock's forearm. The touch was so light that no one watching could have believed it had meaning. But Brock's arms suddenly went numb from wrist to elbow, the muscles refusing to obey. He froze, staring at his limb as if betrayed by his own body. "What the—" he started, but the words cut off when Chuck spoke, his tone even and unhurried. "Energy follows control. Yours is running wild." Brock glared, shaking out his arm, forcing blood back into it. "You think this is a game?" he snarled. "No," Chuck said. "I think you've forgotten what a fight really is." The line hit like a slap. Brock roared again, louder this time, and charged with renewed fury. He threw a right hook, then a left, then a knee, each strike faster and heavier than the last. He was a wall of power and rage, moving with terrifying speed for a man his size. The air cracked around him. Chuck flowed through the storm like smoke. He didn't block, he guided. A shift of the hips sent one punch glancing away. A small pivot deflected a knee. His breathing remained steady, eyes calm, his every movement born from years of precision. To the watching crowd, it looked impossible. One man unleashing chaos, the other dissolving it with stillness. The bar had fallen utterly silent now. No laughter, no whispers, just the sound of boots sliding and fists cutting through air. Brock's face twisted in frustration. Sweat rolled down his temples, muscles straining, veins bulging under his skin. He had never felt this helpless. He had fought men faster, stronger, craftier, but none had refused him the satisfaction of contact. Each miss, each glancing blow that met nothing but the echo of movement, fed his fury. "You can't keep running," he barked. Chuck's voice came soft, almost kind. "I'm not running. You're just not aiming." The remark hit harder than any punch. Brock's eyes blazed. He drove forward with a wild swing, the kind of punch that would have ended a man's night in any cage. Chuck ducked under it, moved in close, and tapped Brock once, just once on the chest, just beneath the ribs. Brock froze, his lungs locked. The pain wasn't sharp. It was deep a pressure that seemed to collapse everything inside him. He stumbled backward, gasping, eyes wide with disbelief. His body didn't respond the way it should. The world tilted. Chuck stood still, watching him. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the bar like a whisper that somehow reached every ear. "You're fighting the wrong enemy." Brock dropped to one knee, clutching his chest, trying to breathe through the invisible vice squeezing his lungs. "What did you do?" "I showed you what it feels like when force meets purpose," Chuck replied. Mike Daniels, standing behind the counter, couldn't move. He'd seen men brawl before seen violence, seen pain, but what he was witnessing wasn't a fight. It was a revelation. The younger man, all muscle and momentum, was being undone by something that didn't even look like effort. One of Brock's friends, pale and trembling, whispered, "Jesus, he killed him." "No," Mike said softly. He's teaching him. Brock's breathing steadied gradually, the pain easing enough for him to rise again. His pride forced him upright even when his body begged to stay down. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and stared at Chuck, whose posture hadn't changed. The man looked as if he'd been carved from stone solid, eternal, and indifferent to time. "What the hell are you?" Brock demanded. Chuck smiled faintly. "A man who's made more mistakes than you can imagine. The difference is I learned from them." "You're talking like some kind of monk," Brock spat. "You think all that philosophy means a damn thing in a real fight?" Chuck's tone didn't change. "It means everything, because a real fight isn't about who hits harder. It's about who understands what hitting costs." The words cut deeper than fists could. Brock felt the heat rise behind his eyes, part fury, part confusion. For a heartbeat, the urge to hit him again was replaced by something heavier, the faint, unwelcome sting of recognition. But he pushed it away with another snarl. He swung again, desperate, as if movement alone could drown out the stillness eating at him. But Chuck had already moved before the fist came. His hand brushed Brock's shoulder, redirected his momentum, and in the same motion he turned, guiding Brock's mass past him. The giant stumbled again, crashing into a table. Glass shattered, spilling beer and broken shards across the floor. The room smelled of alcohol and sweat and fear. Brock pushed himself up, panting, his chest rising and falling like a piston. He turned toward the man who stood quietly in the middle of the wreckage, his every movement betraying control. "This isn't over," he growled. "It can be," Chuck said. "You just have to let it." "Let it?" Brock barked out a laugh, rough and bitter. "You think I can just stop? You think I've come this far, built all this just to walk away?" Chuck looked at him with something that almost resembled pity. "You've built a wall around yourself, but walls don't make you strong, Brock. They make you alone." The name caught him off guard. No one called him that in moments like this. Not in the ring, not on camera, not when adrenaline ruled. For a split second, he wasn't the beast incarnate or the champion. He was just a man standing in front of another who saw him clearly. "Don't," Brock said, the word breaking somewhere between command and plea. "Don't what?" "Don't talk like you know me." Chuck nodded slowly. "Then show me who you are." The challenge was quiet, but it cut through the air sharper than any insult. Brock clenched his fists again, his knuckles whitening. He advanced slowly this time, studying Chuck the way a predator studies prey it can't quite understand. The distance between them vanished in 2 steps. He swung, feinted, drove a knee up toward Chuck's ribs, but the older man anticipated every motion as if reading his thoughts. When Brock's knee came, Chuck shifted an inch to the left. His elbow dropped lightly, meeting Brock's thigh. Not a blow, just a redirection of energy. The power of the strike bled harmlessly into the ground. "Stop trying to win," Chuck said. "Then what the hell am I supposed to do?" Brock shouted, exasperation breaking through the anger. "Listen." "To what?" "Yourself." Brock hesitated, breathing hard. That one word dug under his skin like a splinter. He didn't understand it, didn't want to. All he could feel was the fire inside, the demand to prove himself, to silence this man who stood in defiance of everything he knew about strength. He lunged again, one last time, and the fight condensed into a blur of motion. To the onlookers, it was chaos, chairs tipping, boots sliding, bodies weaving. But to Chuck, it was simple geometry. Every movement of Brock's body predicted the next. Every exhalation, every shift of weight told him what was coming before it arrived. Then in one seamless motion, Chuck stepped inside Brock's guard, his left hand catching the giant's wrist, his right palm pressing gently into the space just below the ribs. It wasn't a strike. It was a conversation, a message sent through touch. Brock stopped dead. His body froze, breath leaving him in a rush. The pain wasn't blinding, but it was complete, all-encompassing. For a heartbeat, he felt suspended between 2 worlds, his mind blank, his body unmoored. Chuck withdrew his hand and stepped back. Brock staggered, dropped to one knee again, and gasped for air. His heart hammered against his ribs. The fight, the endless need to assert, to dominate, drained out of him like water through sand. Around them, the crowd stared in disbelief. The only sound was Brock's ragged breathing and the faint buzz of the neon light outside. Chuck looked down at him. "You're not weak," he said quietly. "You're just angry at the wrong things." Brock lifted his head, his face pale, eyes burning with something that wasn't rage anymore. It was confusion, maybe fear, or the dawning realization that strength without control meant nothing. Chuck didn't wait for an answer. He stepped back, giving the man space to rise if he chose. His presence filled the room, calm and unshaken. Brock's trembling hand found the edge of a fallen chair. He pulled himself upright, his breath steadier now but shallow, his pride cracked open like the splintered stool at their feet. He met Chuck's gaze again, and for the first time that night, he didn't see an opponent. He saw something else, something he didn't have a name for. "What was that?" he asked, his voice raw. Chuck's expression softened. Perspective. Brock's jaw tightened, but the anger was gone. In its place was a quiet that scared him more. Chuck glanced toward the bar. "You'll breathe easier in a minute. Sit down, drink some water." The absurdity of the suggestion almost made Brock laugh. He had come here to prove something, to remind the world who he was. Now he was being told to hydrate by the man he'd tried to destroy. But he didn't argue. Slowly he sank onto a stool, the old wood creaking beneath his weight. Mike poured a glass and slid it toward him wordlessly. Chuck turned toward the door. "Where the hell are you going?" Brock asked hoarsely. "Outside," Chuck said. "Storm's almost over." Brock frowned. "What storm?" Chuck glanced back, his face half in shadow. "The one you brought with you." And with that, he walked out into the night. The door swung closed behind him, the sound of the hinges soft as the first breath after a storm. Inside, Brock sat still, the water untouched, the crowd too stunned to move. He wasn't sure whether he'd lost or learned, maybe both. But as he sat there, chest aching and heart strangely light, one thought lingered, echoing in his mind like the rhythm of his own pulse. He hadn't been fighting a man at all. He'd been fighting himself. The desert wind was still moaning outside when the door of the Iron Spur swung shut behind Chuck Norris. The faint clatter of glass settling on the counter was the only sound that followed him. For several moments, the bar remained in absolute silence, as though time itself was trying to understand what had just taken place. Brock Lesnar sat at one of the stools, hunched forward, his forearms resting heavily on the counter, breathing unevenly. The air smelled of spilled beer and adrenaline, the metallic tang of tension still lingering on the tongue. No one dared to speak first. The crowd that had filled the bar only minutes earlier with laughter and cheers now stood in stunned stillness. Every face reflected a strange mixture of disbelief and awe. They had come for a night of whiskey and stories, maybe a fight worth boasting about later. But what they had witnessed wasn't a fight. It was something else, something unsettling, something that had cracked the illusion of invincibility that hung over the man sitting before them. Brock wiped a hand across his mouth, the sweat cooling on his skin. His massive shoulders rose and fell with each breath. He could still feel it, the ghost of the old man's touch, that single, precise moment when his body had stopped obeying him. It wasn't pain in the usual sense. It was something deeper, a message written into his nerves. He clenched his jaw and tried to push the thought away, but it stayed, stubborn as a bruise that refused to fade. Mike Daniels, standing behind the bar, watched him carefully. He didn't speak either. He was old enough to know when words would do more harm than good. For a few minutes, he simply cleaned the same glass over and over, giving Brock space to wrestle with his own silence. Finally, the younger man looked up. "He just walked out." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah." Brock's eyes narrowed. Like it was nothing. "Maybe to him it wasn't," the bartender said softly. Brock let out a low laugh, humorless and bitter. "To him. That's what everyone keeps saying, right? To him. You all saw what happened. He barely touched me. Barely moved. That's not normal." "No," Mike said. "It's not." Brock pushed away from the counter, his boots scraping against the floorboards. "He humiliated me. Right here, in front of everyone. And you're just standing there like it was some kind of lesson." Mike sighed. "Maybe it was." "Lesson," Brock snapped, turning on him. You think I came here to be taught something by some old man? I think you came here looking for something, Mike said, his tone even. You just didn't know what. Brock stared at him, unsure whether to punch him or demand an explanation. You don't know a damn thing about me. I don't have to, Mike replied. I've seen your kind before. Men who think fighting's the only language worth speaking. They win 1,000 battles, but every victory leaves them emptier than the last. Until one day they meet someone who doesn't speak that language at all. The words hit harder than Brock wanted to admit. He looked away, toward the door where Chuck had disappeared. You think he's better than me? I think he stopped needing to prove it a long time ago. Brock's hands tightened into fists, but not in anger, more from the need to hold on to something solid. His entire life had been a series of fights, victories stacked on top of one another, until they became a tower too tall to see the ground beneath. For the first time, he realized he didn't know what was under it. He turned back to Mike, his voice quieter now. What was that? Thing he did? When he touched me? Ask him, Mike said. Brock gave a harsh laugh. You think I'm going to chase some old man down a dirt road to ask for advice? Then maybe you'll keep wondering why your strength didn't matter. The room was beginning to empty out. The spectators were leaving quietly, stepping carefully as though afraid to disturb the ghosts that lingered in the air. Brock barely noticed them go. He poured himself another drink from the bottle he'd left half empty, took a long swallow, and stared at the counter. The whiskey burned, but it didn't help. The hollow space inside him only widened. He could still see Chuck's face in his mind, calm, untroubled, almost sad. That look bothered him more than the fight itself. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. As if the man had looked straight through him and seen everything he'd tried to bury beneath muscle and noise. He set the bottle down too hard, and the sharp clink broke the uneasy quiet. Mike didn't flinch. You ever lose a fight? Brock asked suddenly. Mike paused, thinking. Yeah, a few. What did you do after? Learned something, Mike said. Like what? That most fights aren't about the other guy. Brock shook his head. You sound like him. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Brock turned away, exhaling hard. He couldn't sit still anymore. The walls of the iron spur felt too close, the air too heavy. Without another word, he walked toward the door. The last of the regulars watched him go, stepping aside as though giving him a path through the wreckage. The broken table, the shattered glass, the overturned stool, all reminders of a battle that had already been lost long before it began. Outside, the night had deepened. The desert sky stretched wide and black, scattered with cold stars. Brock's truck sat under the flickering light of the sign, a thin layer of dust already settling on the hood. He stood there for a while, staring at the empty road. The wind tugged at his shirt, carrying with it the faint echo of the words still looping through his head. You're fighting the wrong enemy. He climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. The growl of it filled the night, but it didn't drown out the silence that had taken root inside him. He drove without direction, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. The yellow lines blurred beneath the headlights, and with every passing mile, his thoughts became heavier. He tried to replay the fight in his mind, to find some flaw, some explanation, but each memory only made the truth clearer. It wasn't about power. It had never been. The old man had seen through him, not because of what he was, but because of what he wasn't. He pressed harder on the gas. The truck roared down the empty road, dust rising behind it like a ghost trail. Eventually, he pulled over near a stretch of desert where the land fell away into shallow dunes. He killed the engine and stepped out, the cool night air hitting his skin. The silence here was thicker, heavier, alive with the hum of distant insects and the faint whisper of the wind against the sand. He walked a few steps from the truck and stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring into the dark horizon. The sky was massive, a black ocean filled with light. Out here, his size didn't matter. His fame didn't matter. Even his strength, his greatest weapon, felt small beneath the weight of it all. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. It came unevenly at first, then steadied. In the stillness, he could almost hear the echo of Chuck's voice again. You're not weak. You're just angry at the wrong things. He wanted to argue, to reject it, but the words wouldn't leave him. They stayed, circling like a hawk over the landscape of his thoughts. He realized with a quiet kind of horror that he didn't even know what he was angry about anymore. The fights, the noise, the spotlight, they had all blurred into one long roar, and now for the first time, there was nothing but silence. He stood there for a long time, the wind brushing past him, carrying the scent of dry sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to pierce through the dark. Brock looked down at his hands, huge, scarred, calloused hands that had broken bones, won titles, lifted trophies. Hands that could destroy but couldn't heal. He flexed them slowly, then lowered them. The strength that had once defined him now felt like a weight he didn't know how to carry. Back at the bar, Mike locked up for the night. The place was quiet again, save for the soft hum of the neon outside. As he wiped down the counter, he noticed something left behind, a small chip of broken wood from the stool, lying near the corner table. He picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. There was a strange peace in that moment, as though the storm had finally passed, but the memory of it lingered. He looked toward the door, thinking of the two men who had stood on opposite sides of everything, one ruled by noise, the other by silence, and wondered which of them had really won. Out on the highway, Brock climbed back into his truck. He didn't start the engine right away. He sat there staring at his reflection in the windshield, the ghost of his own face looking back at him. The old man's words played again in his mind, steady as a heartbeat. The fight ends when someone stops learning. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the steering wheel, and let the thought settle. When the engine finally rumbled to life, the sound was softer, less defiant. He turned the truck toward the horizon, where the faintest hint of dawn was beginning to color the edge of the sky. The darkness was breaking, but it wasn't gone yet. Behind him, the iron spur stood alone on the roadside, its neon sign flickering like the last heartbeat of a dying fire. Inside, the bar would remember the night when strength met silence, when force met purpose, and when the unbreakable learned that even the strongest walls can fracture from within. And on that empty desert road, Brock Lesnar drove toward the rising sun, his shadow long against the sand, the first cracks of understanding forming quietly inside the armor he had spent a lifetime building. The first light of dawn stretched across the desert horizon, turning the barren landscape into a quiet sea of gold. Brock Lesnar's truck rumbled down the empty stretch of Highway 66, its tires humming against the asphalt like a slow heartbeat. He hadn't slept. The memories of the night before clung to him like desert dust, impossible to shake off no matter how far he drove. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment again. Chuck Norris standing perfectly still, calm as stone, while Brock's own strength turned to chaos around him. That single surgical strike that had folded him, not through brute force, but through something deeper: knowledge, precision, control. He kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was luck. Maybe he'd just misstepped. But each excuse he crafted collapsed before it finished forming. The truth sat there in the back of his mind, immovable and irritating as a splinter under skin. Chuck had been right. He hadn't been fighting a man. He'd been fighting himself. The road narrowed between two long ridges of rock. The sun climbed higher, washing the desert in harsh light. Brock squinted at the glare, his reflection ghosting faintly across the windshield. For the first time in years, he saw not the image that filled posters or interviews, the invincible fighter, the larger-than-life champion, but something smaller, human, tired. He exhaled heavily and pulled the truck to the side of the road. The engine idled a moment before he cut it off, leaving him in silence broken only by the chirring of insects in the distance. He stepped out, boots crunching against gravel, and leaned against the hood. The heat was already rising, the air rippling above the sand. Somewhere behind him, a hawk cried from a cliff edge. The stillness should have been peaceful, but it only reminded him how loud his mind had become. He thought of Mike's words from the night before. Most fights aren't about the other guy. He hadn't understood it then. Maybe he didn't even now, but something inside him was starting to shift, just slightly, like an old foundation cracking under the weight of realization. He rubbed his hand across his chest where Chuck had struck him. The tenderness was still there, Not bruised, but deeper. A strange reminder that power didn't always need to announce itself with pain. For the first time since he was a teenager, Brock wondered what it meant to actually understand fighting, rather than just survive it. He'd spent his life chasing dominance, defining himself through the people he'd broken, the titles he'd won. Every fight had been proof of who he was. Yet standing there in the morning light, he realized he couldn't even remember what he'd been trying to prove. He pushed himself off the truck and started walking toward the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and the sky above seemed too big for a man to exist under without feeling small. The weight of it pressed on him, humbling in a way no opponent had ever managed. Somewhere out there, the old man was walking too. He knew it. Chuck Norris didn't strike him as the kind to stick around after a lesson was taught. He probably just kept moving, as steady as that desert wind. The thought settled into Brock's mind like a challenge, not one born of ego, but of something quieter. By mid-morning, he reached a small roadside diner, a lonely building with peeling paint and a rusted sign that read Maggie's Place. The parking lot was nearly empty. He pushed open the door, and a little bell jingled overhead. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of coffee and bacon grease. A middle-aged waitress looked up from behind the counter, squinting against the sunlight that poured in with him. "Morning," she said. Brock nodded. "Coffee, black." She poured it without a word. He sat at a booth near the window, staring out across the dusty road. A radio played softly from somewhere behind the counter, the kind of old country song that seemed made for lonely highways and half-empty diners. The waitress returned with the cup. "Rough night?" she asked with the kind of knowing tone that didn't really need an answer. "Something like that," Brock muttered. She smiled faintly. "You're not the first to find trouble at the Spur. Heard there was a real scene out there last night." "Some kind of fight?" He froze, his hand halfway to the cup. "You heard about that?" She nodded. "Small town. News travels faster than the wind out here." Brock leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "You could say it was a fight, though I'm not sure that's what it really was." Her brow furrowed. "You sound like you're still figuring it out." "Yeah," he said quietly. "So am I." She studied him for a moment, then shrugged and moved on to another table. Brock took a sip of his coffee. It was hot, bitter, grounding. Outside, a truck passed on the highway, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. He thought about going back to his hotel, maybe flying out, putting the whole night behind him. But the thought didn't sit right. He couldn't just leave it there, unfinished. Something about the old man's words had gotten under his skin. He needed to understand. When he stepped outside again, the heat had grown sharper, biting against his skin. He climbed back into his truck and sat there for a long time, the keys resting in his palm. Then he started the engine and turned the wheel knot toward the highway, but back in the direction he had come. The drive back to the Iron Spur was slower this time. The miles felt heavier, each one marked by the weight of reflection. The adrenaline that had once ruled him was gone, replaced by a quiet focus he hadn't felt before. When he reached the bar, the parking lot was empty except for Mike's old pickup. The neon sign was dark now. The place closed until evening. But the door was unlocked. He pushed it open, and the familiar smell of wood polish and old beer greeted him. Mike was behind the counter, counting bottles. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Didn't think I'd see you again," the bartender said. "I wasn't sure you would," Brock admitted. Mike nodded toward the counter. "You come to break another stool?" Brock cracked a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No, I came to ask you something." "About him?" "Yeah," Brock said. "Where'd he go?" Mike set the bottle down and leaned on the counter. "He didn't say. Doesn't usually. Just paid for his water and walked out." "You know him?" "Used to," Mike said after a moment. "Long time ago. We trained together back when I thought I wanted to be a fighter. He was already different, even then quieter, sharper. Didn't talk much about technique. He talked about control, about being still enough to see what others miss." Brock's gaze drifted to the floor. "Control," he repeated. "That's what I don't get. I've spent my whole life training for power, strength, speed. But he..." Mike nodded. "He spent his learning how not to need them." Brock frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It will," Mike said, "once you stop trying to understand it with your fists." The words settled between them like dust. Brock turned them over in his mind, slow and heavy. "Where would he go?" he asked finally. Mike thought for a long moment. "He's got a place not far from here. Old cabin by the ridge, about 10 miles west. Used to be a ranger station before the fire shut it down. If you're going there, go to listen, not to fight." "I'm not looking for a rematch," Brock said quietly. "I just need to know what happened." Mike gave a slow nod. "Then maybe he'll tell you?" The drive toward the ridge was rough, the road more dirt than pavement. The land rose and fell in rolling dunes of red earth, dotted with low scrub and twisted trees. The sun had reached its peak, and heat shimmered off the horizon. When Brock finally spotted the cabin, it looked almost like part of the landscape itself. Wood-weathered gray, roof patched with tin, a single porch shaded by an overhanging oak. He parked the truck and stepped out. For a moment he thought the place was deserted. Then he saw him. Chuck Norris sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood, his movements slow and precise. He looked up when Brock approached, but didn't speak. His eyes were steady, patient, like the desert itself. Brock stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You knew I'd come." Chuck's knife paused, the blade glinting in the sunlight. "Didn't have to know," he said. "Some lessons need more than one round." Brock climbed the steps, stopping a few feet away. "You humiliated me last night." Chuck didn't deny it. "No, you did that to yourself." The words landed softly, but they hit deep. Brock clenched his jaw. "I've fought for 20 years. I've been hit by men twice your size. Nobody's ever done what you did." Chuck set the wood aside, the half-carved figure resting on the railing. "Because they were fighting your body," he said. "I was fighting your imbalance." "My what?" "You fight with anger," Chuck said. "Every move you make starts there. That's power, but it's also poison. It blinds you. You can't read your opponent if you're too busy reacting to your own fire." Brock frowned, crossing his arms. "So you're saying I should just be calm? That's your secret?" Chuck smiled faintly. "Calm isn't weakness. It's awareness. When you're calm, you don't waste energy. You don't fight the world. You move with it." Brock sank onto the porch step, his shoulders sagging. "That's easy for you to say. You've already figured it out." Chuck shook his head. "You never figure it out. You practice it every day. Some days you win, some days you forget." The two men sat in silence for a long time. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of cedar and sun-warmed dust. Brock stared out at the horizon. "You think it's too late for me?" Chuck followed his gaze. "Too late for what?" "To change," Brock said. Chuck picked up the carving again, examining the grain of the wood. "You changed the moment you came back here," he said. Brock looked at him, confused. "I don't feel different." "Change doesn't start with feeling," Chuck said. "It starts with realizing you need it." For the first time since the fight, Brock felt something like peace flicker in his chest. Not certainty, not understanding, but the faint warmth of a door cracking open somewhere inside him. He watched as Chuck resumed his slow, patient work with the knife. The shavings fell at his feet, each one smaller and more precise than the last. Brock sat quietly, the sound of the blade steady in the dry air. Maybe this was what control looked like. Not power, not domination, but stillness carved one breath at a time. When the sun began to sink, Brock stood. "Thank you," he said. Chuck looked up, a hint of a smile touching his weathered face. "Don't thank me. Go live what you've learned." Brock nodded. He turned toward the truck, pausing once to look back. Chuck had already returned to his carving, as though nothing more needed to be said. The desert glowed orange in the dying light, and for the first time in years, Brock felt the fire inside him, quiet to an ember instead of a storm. As he drove away, the night crept back over the land, and in the rearview mirror, the old cabin faded into shadow. The road ahead was long, but for once he didn't dread it. He drove not to escape, but to return to something he hadn't known he'd lost. And somewhere behind him, on that lonely porch, the old master kept carving, shaping something new from what was once just rough, unformed wood. The next morning came slow and golden over the desert, painting the endless sand with warmth that almost felt like forgiveness. Brock Lesnar's truck rolled quietly along the empty highway, its tires crunching on gravel, the hum of the engine blending with the wind that whispered across the plains. The events of the past 2 nights lived inside him like a storm that had finally broken. He wasn't sure if he'd found peace, but something inside had shifted, something subtle, fragile, like the first sprout after a wildfire. He gripped the wheel loosely, the tension gone from his hands, and for the first time in years, he wasn't driving towards something. He was simply moving. He'd spent the night parked near a dried-out riverbed, sleeping in the cab under a blanket of stars. The dreams that had haunted him for years, echoes of fights, crowds, and the weight of expectation had not come. In their place was silence. Not empty silence, but full, the kind that comes when a man finally stops running from himself. He thought of Chuck Norris sitting on that porch, carving wood with the patience of someone who had long since made peace with time. Brock had watched him for hours before leaving, noticing the precision in every movement, the steady breath behind each cut. There was power there, but no aggression, and it was the first time Brock had understood that those two things didn't have to live together. Now, as he drove back towards civilization, he replayed the old man's words. "You changed the moment you came back." He hadn't known it then, but now he felt the truth of it. Change wasn't a thunderclap. It was a slow burn, a reckoning between who you'd been and who you were trying to become. The small town of Rivergate appeared on the horizon, quiet and sun-bleached. The iron spur sat at its edge like a monument to old sins, its sign flickering weakly in the heat. Brock pulled into the dirt lot and cut the engine. For a while he didn't move. The bar looked smaller now, the world around it less threatening. He could almost hear the echo of that first night, the laughter, the shouting, the shatter of glass, the crack of wood against bone. It felt like a lifetime ago. When he finally stepped out of the truck, he didn't walk like a man burdened by anger. His stride was measured, almost peaceful. He pushed open the door, and the little bell jingled overhead. Mike Daniels looked up from the counter, surprise flashing briefly across his face before settling into a quiet smile. "Didn't expect to see you again this soon," he said. Brock returned the smile faintly. "Guess I'm full of surprises." The bartender nodded toward the same corner table where it had all started. "That spot's still yours if you want it." Brock glanced at it and shook his head. "Not today. I think I've had enough sitting and brooding." Mike chuckled. "Can't argue with that. Coffee?" "Yeah," Brock said. "Black." The smell of it filled the room as Mike poured, the rich aroma grounding the space in familiarity. Brock took a seat at the bar, resting his arms on the wood. "Quiet morning?" "Quieter than that night you came through," Mike said, sliding the mug across. "Word about that fight got around. Folks been talking for days. Some say you lost it. Others say you found something." Brock took a sip, the heat biting pleasantly at his tongue. "Maybe both." Mike studied him for a moment. "You look different. Calmer." "I feel different," Brock admitted. "Don't know if that's good or bad yet." "It's good," Mike said simply. "Trust me." They fell into silence, the kind that only exists between men who have already said enough. The ticking of the old clock above the counter was the only sound for a while. Finally, Brock set the mug down. "You ever see him again?" "Chuck?" Mike asked. "Not since you left. He's not one to stick around. Comes through when he's needed, then disappears. Always has." Brock nodded slowly. "Yeah, sounds about right." He paused. "He told me something about balance, about fighting with awareness. I thought I understood it, but it's harder than I thought. Every instinct I've got wants to swing, to react. It's like trying to stop a flood with your hands." Mike smiled faintly. "That's why he said it's practice. You don't master peace once. You keep choosing it." Brock looked at him, then at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The face staring back wasn't the one that used to glare out from posters or interviews. The edges were softer, not in strength, but in presence. He looked like a man who had stopped trying to be something and started simply being. The bell over the door rang again, breaking the quiet. 2 local men stepped in, rough around the edges but harmless enough. They nodded toward Mike, ordered beers, and took a seat near the window. For a few minutes, everything felt almost normal, but as Brock sipped his coffee, one of them turned and said, "Hey, ain't you that guy from the fight? The wrestler?" Brock didn't look up. "Used to be," the man laughed. "Heard you got your ass handed to you by some old cowboy." His buddy chuckled. "Yeah, what was his name? Chuck something?" Mike shot them both a warning glance, but Brock waved him off. "It's fine." He turned on his stool, meeting their eyes. "Yeah, that was me." The first man grinned, waiting for defensiveness, for anger, but none came. "And yeah," Brock continued, "he handed me my ass, and I'm grateful for it." The laughter died immediately. The two men exchanged confused looks, muttered something about minding their business, and went back to their beers. Brock turned back to his coffee. Mike shook his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That right there," he said. "That's growth." "Feels weird," Brock admitted. "Yeah," Mike said. "It usually does." Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling light across the town. Brock finished his drink, thanked Mike, and stepped out into the heat. The air smelled of dust and sage, the same scent that had clung to Chuck's porch. He stood there for a while, just breathing, feeling the wind press gently against his face. He didn't have a plan anymore, and for the first time that didn't scare him. The road stretched out ahead, endless and waiting. Somewhere down that road there'd be more noise, more crowds, more expectations. But now he knew he didn't have to meet them with the same fire. The fight would always be there, inside and out. But he finally understood what Chuck had meant. It wasn't about winning. It was about choosing which battles were worth the cost. He started walking toward his truck, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. As he reached the door, a voice called from behind him. "Brock!" He turned. It was Mike standing in the doorway, shielding his eyes from the sun. "He left this for you," he said, holding out a small object wrapped in cloth. Brock frowned and walked back. Mike handed it over. The cloth was rough, tied with a thin strip of leather. Brock untied it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a small wooden carving, the one Chuck had been working on when they spoke. It was a hawk, wings spread wide, carved with the kind of patience that only comes from years of practice. The surface was smooth, the edges exact. There were words carved into the base. "Strength without balance is destruction." Brock traced the letters with his thumb, his throat tightening. "He really made this?" "Left it this morning," Mike said. "Didn't say much. Just told me to make sure you got it." Brock looked out toward the road, squinting against the light. "You know where he went?" Mike shrugged. "He never says. He just keeps moving." Brock smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess that's how he lives." He tucked the carving carefully into his jacket and nodded his thanks. Mike gave a small wave and disappeared back inside. For a long moment, Brock stood there, the carving heavy in his palm, the desert wind sweeping across the horizon. He thought about the old man, about stillness, about control, about the quiet power of a life lived without the need to prove itself. The words on the carving echoed through him, sinking deeper than anything he'd ever heard in an arena. He climbed into the truck, set the hawk on the dashboard, and started the engine. The road stretched ahead like an invitation, the sun blazing at its end. He didn't know where it led, and for once that didn't matter. He drove with the window down, the wind in his face, the desert unfolding around him in shades of gold and red. The world felt wider now and lighter. Every mile put more distance between him and the man he used to be. By the time the iron spur was just a speck in the rearview mirror, the weight in his chest had turned to something new, not pride, not victory, but understanding. The kind that doesn't shout or demand recognition, the kind that simply is. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in a cabin surrounded by silence, Chuck Norris sat on his porch again, carving another piece of wood, the faint sound of the knife against grain blending with the wind. He paused for a moment, smiled slightly, and looked out at the desert, as though he could still feel the echo of a student finally learning to stand still. The storm had passed. What remained was clarity, the reckoning between strength and peace, between fire and stillness. And in that endless quiet, Two men miles apart breathed the same air, bound not by combat, but by the understanding that true power had never been about how hard one could strike, but how deeply one could see. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable, true-to-life tales like this one. Don't forget to share this video with your friends. You never know who might need to hear it. And if you're ready for more, watch the next video right now. The story only gets deeper.